There is zero doubt that justice has been served, and today is the day.
That's Carroll County Sheriff Tony Liggett today, one of many reacting to a judge's decision to sentence Richard Allen to 130 years in prison for killing Abby Williams and Libby German back in 2017.
That sentence handed down this morning, 3 weeks or so after a jury convicted him on all counts. It is a case that has thrust the small town of Delphi, Indiana into the national spotlight for the last 7+ years.
And we have team coverage of today's developments. We're going to go back to Delphi to hear from Bob Siegel and Emily Longnecker coming up at 5. But right now we're bringing in our 13 News legal analyst, Katie Jackson-Lindsay. She's here to help us break down this sentence. I mean, 130 years. How did the judge come up with that number specifically, seeing as how there are four charges that they were convicted of, he was convicted of?
So what we saw today is what we absolutely expected and talked about previously in terms of how the charges would play out. While he was convicted on 4 charges, our law prohibits a person from being sentenced for the same conduct more than once. That's double jeopardy, right? And so in this scenario, while he was convicted on 4 of those charges, 2 of those convictions had to be vacated so that he was not penalized for the same conduct more than once.
Okay.
And so ultimately, what we saw was a sentence on 2 murder charges, and the penalty range was 45 to 65 years. And so ultimately, she gave him the maximum sentence for each conviction.
Could she have sentenced him to serve those sentences concurrently, in other words, at the same time? She specifically chose consecutively, one after the other?
Sure, she could have absolutely sentenced them concurrently, but when you think of that sense of fairness and justice to these families, there were 2 lives that were lost. There were 2 girls that were murdered in this case, and so I think what she did in terms of consecutive sentences is what everyone expected.
So what's happening here? Meaning the jury is deciding whether or not someone is guilty or innocent, but it still seems like the judge has a lot of control over how the process gets carried out, how the law gets applied. It's not really, it's both.
Sure, and that's one of the things that the jury is instructed on, is that they are only there to determine whether or not the state has met their burden. They have no burden. In our state of Indiana, they have no burden, or they don't have to be bothered with the idea that they have to find an appropriate sentence for this person. And so to some extent, that's a model that works out well for citizens, because a jury is not burdened by the consequences so much as they are deciding the fact.
Is that different in other states, though? Are there some states where they also determine the sentence?
Yes, there are some states where they determine the sentence, and there are a lot of nuances involved in that. Sometimes we see in other jurisdictions where they determine if life is appropriate or death penalty is appropriate and all those things, and none of that is relevant here, and there are nuances even in our state related to those topics, but in our state, the judge alone decides the appropriate sentence.
What's your overall opinion just on this legal process, the trial, the case? I mean, do you think that there's anything that could have been done on the defense perspective, from a defense perspective?
I don't think so. I don't think there's anything that the defense could have done differently to change the outcome here. I think that this was a verdict that the jury decided based on the evidence that was presented to them. And we saw very good lawyering from the defense on this case. So I don't think that this case was lost because of bad lawyering. I think ultimately the jury believed they met their burden, and these lawyers were brilliant in their work in their defense of Richard Allen.
And so Richard Allen's on his way to prison now.
He is.
Okay. All right. Katie Jackson-Lindsay, as always, thank you so much for
Thank
breaking
you for
this
having
down.
me.
We'll see you again at 5:30.
Okay.